This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, hello everyone. It is 12 o'clock on the East Coast, and we are going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. My name is Jessica Enix, and I would like to welcome you to today's ASA webinar, Prevailing Wage Summit. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few points of protocol so that you'll get the most out of your webinar experience. Remember, you are listening to the conference via a conference service. If you are disconnected, repeat the steps that were given to you in the registration email. In order to reduce background noise, please be aware that all microphones are muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. A chat icon is located on the top right-hand side of your screen. The presenter will address questions as they become available or at the conclusion of the presentation. Please note that today's program is being recorded. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Mr. Nat Peniston. Nat is a national expert on government-funded prevailing wage obligations and works closely with construction contractors to ensure proper compliance, particularly in bona fide employee benefit strategies. An accomplished author, he has published numerous articles in the Associated Builders and Contractors Construction Executive magazine and published the book, The Contractor's Guide to the Davis-Bacon Act, Essential Knowledge for Bidding and Compliance on Prevailing Wage Jobs. Nat is the immediate past chairman of the board for the Central Texas chapter of the Associated Builders and Contractors and is involved in various charitable organizations. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Miami and lives in Austin, Texas with his wife and 2 daughters. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Nat Peniston.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Really appreciate it and glad to be with everyone today. Hopefully we'll have this be very interactive, so please do put in any questions in the chat box and I will endeavor to answer them. Quick background on our firm. Jessica just talked about me a little bit, but we've been members of ASA for quite some time. We're on our 40th anniversary this year, and we literally started this business, which was prevailing wage bona fide benefits for non-union or merit shop government contractors. So been doing this a long time, have a lot of experience, and happy to share some of our knowledge with everyone today. So quick disclaimer for the attorneys out there or would-be attorneys. This is information that's broad-based. All of it is public and verifiable. This is not intended to be tax or legal or accounting advice specific to your circumstances. We are not tax or legal advisors, but if you do have individual questions about your company, we're happy to do our best to work through those and or put you in touch with accounting or tax professionals. So first thing I'm going to cover is the Inflation Reduction Act. And there are 2 acts, the Infrastructure Bill, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and the Inflation Reduction Act. For the first time, literally in the history of the United States, we're applying prevailing wage mandates to private projects. And so there's a tremendous amount of work out there between these 2 bills. And actually a 3rd bill called the CHIPS Act, but I'm not going to get into the CHIPS Act because that tends to be a very different audience. But know that there's actually 3 bills with the CHIPS Act. And while you've got tremendous amounts of federal spending as well as state spending going on in infrastructure, you have commercial construction really taking the foot off the gas, or arguably foot on the brakes. Here in Austin, there was a large office tower that was to be built. They had already dug the hole, gotten all of the permits and so forth, and stopped the project right there. And that's here in Austin that's growing like gangbusters. So office construction that has been the bread and butter for a lot of contractors, that's probably not going to be as much of an opportunity moving forward. The Inflation Reduction Act specifically applies to the construction, alteration, and repair of clean energy. And it's a little bit of a misnomer that it was called the Inflation Reduction Act. It really has nothing to do with inflation. Arguably, it's going to cause inflation, but that's beside the point. What Congress wants to call something is really up to them. Previously, there were tax incentives for creating clean energy. Those tax incentives have been scrapped and totally replaced. So for instance, there was an old baseline rate of approximately 6%, and then a bonus rate depending on various thresholds and to-dos, if you will, that took it all the way up to that now is 5 times that, up to 30%. So prevailing wage in the private sector is a little bit of a misnomer. Historically, prevailing wage, and we're going to talk more about this, has been government-funded projects. But now, with this Inflation Reduction Act, with these funds, to get these tax credits, the developers, or what the code calls taxpayers, need to pay prevailing wages for their craft workers, and they have certain registered apprentice requirements. Notice that I say registered apprentices. So these are government registered apprenticeship programs, such as the unions or other associations might have for their workers. So the infrastructure bill, we're talking about well over $500 billion in new investment. This is additional investment beyond what has previously been spent. So I won't read this whole list to you, but we're talking about massive amounts of money, over $100 billion for roads, public transportation, rail, high-speed internet, clean drinking water, airports, environmental remediation, and electric vehicle chargers. Basically, the government is going to be putting in the equivalent of the Tesla supercharger network at government expense instead of private business expense. But there are going to be chargers virtually everywhere because we're spending $7.5 billion on building them. So quick background on the Davis-Bacon Act and prevailing wage. This was passed back in 1931. So as you may recall from your American history, that was the depths of the Great Depression. So the 29 crash had occurred, millions and millions of people were out of work. And essentially, this was a bill that had been proposed for several years, didn't really gain traction, essentially as a minimum wage law. And so that's really the way to think about prevailing wage, is that it's a minimum wage law. The background was that there was a New York project that was won by non-local, non-union labor, and the local union said, this isn't right, that our tax dollars are going to build a local project that doesn't pay us and that we're not being used on these projects. So very much focused on minimum wage by geography. So essentially by county, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So how did they arrive at these wages? Well, the Department of Labor does these wage and hour surveys. So they're sending out more than 130,000 unique wage and benefit rates throughout the country. Essentially, that's 3,000 counties times 4 types of construction, building, heavy, highway, and residential. Heavy is essentially the bucket that the other 3, anything that doesn't fit in the other 3 captures. So things like dams or water projects or those types of things would all fall into heavy. Highway is kind of obvious, residential is kind of obvious, and building is more kind of your traditional commercial spaces. And approximately 20 trades, so electricians, plumbers, and craftspeople. Unfortunately, merit shop contractors historically have been focusing on their business and really haven't participated in the survey process. Part of the reason for that is it's perceived to be difficult, and then the other reason is that there's no incentive to respond. It's just kind of perceived as a waste of time, and therefore union wage rates prevail. The union is highly incentivized to respond because as they inflate these wages and fringe benefits, then the unions make more money, and that their perception is that they're there to support the union and wage rates and fringe benefits and so forth. So even though unions are only about 14% of the construction workforce, their wage rates prevail on these wage determinations and public projects about 63% of the time. So if you're so inclined, I would encourage you to actually participate in these surveys. They're actually not difficult to do. You could just Google wage survey, Department of Labor, and it pops right up, and fill in basic information such as the project and what wages you provided and so on, submit it electronically, and then that will go into that wage survey process. See a question here, what is Merit Shop? So Merit Shop is non-union. So if you are a union contractor, that means you're a signatory to say the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. That's the union. Merit Shop is I hire my own employees, and I'm non-union, and I'm looking for the best merit, not someone who's been a part of the union a certain amount of time. Does that answer the question? Okay, so I'm frequently asked, how do I tell if prevailing wage regulations apply? And it really comes back to the payer. And the payer, if the payer is the federal government, and the project cost is over $2,000, then that is subject to the Davis-Bacon Act. Where some people get caught up is they don't realize that even if it's a grant or a loan guarantee, or the government's just paying for insurance, residential, some contractors are doing multifamily housing. There's something called the Housing and Urban Development Community Development Block Grant Program. So those are grants that are for residential, for low-income housing. Well, that makes it prevailing wage. Overtime is after 40 hours per week, and you have to have your certified payroll reports or CPRs submitted to that applicable public body within 10 days after the payment of the wages. We'll talk more about certified payroll reports. And then good to know that Davis-Bacon preempts state prevailing wage laws if it is a federal project only. So think a military base, that's a federal project only. Frequently, there are multiple sources of funding. Say a school might have local, state, and federal funding. Then it can get a little bit more complicated depending on the state that you're in. Like New Jersey actually mandates the higher of the two. So if a carpenter is Davis-Bacon wage survey at $40 federal, and then wage survey state says $45, you'd actually have to go by the $45. But fundamentally, it's who is the payer, where's the job located? So I know this may be a little bit small and hard to see, but essentially this is a screenshot of the Davis-Bacon WH347, which is the federal certified payroll report that's to be filled out. Most people are now submitting these electronically, not using this paper form, but I like to just kind of utilize the paper form as a illustration of what you have to do. So basically, it's detailed information around your employees, what you're paying your employees, what their job occupation was, what the hours that they worked were, what benefits you offered. And you'll notice in the very bottom of the page, there's a little checkbox where fringe benefits are paid to approved plans, funds, or programs. That's what one would check if you were to use fringe benefits for their intended purpose, which is bona fide benefits. We'll talk more about that. But a little bit of a check-in. Prevailing wage laws mandate what? Do they mandate a specific minimum wage by craft and location, a specific minimum wage by craft, specific minimum wage by location, or a specific maximum wage by craft and location? So the answer is number one. Again, it's a minimum wage law by that craft and by that location. So someone in Newark, New Jersey that's a carpenter is going to have a different wage rate than someone in Los Angeles that's an electrician. Here's an example of a California wage determination. Not all wage determinations look this complicated, but I went with California because it's the most complicated. Frequently, you just have base hourly rate and health and welfare, and that health and welfare includes things like pension and vacation and holiday and so forth. Just know that everything is very much predetermined. So the job occupation, what they are required to be paid as a base wage, what they're required to be paid as a fringe benefit. So a couple of suggestions here. Number one, wage rates must be posted. And they must be easily seen by employees. So this is the WH 1321. In fact, the government stipulates that it has to be printed on 11 by 17 paper. It has to include those wage determinations, and it has to be in an accessible place. So it cannot be in a binder in a truck or a trailer. It has to actually be posted. Many states have other postings that have to be posted. My suggestion would be that you actually take a picture of it posted so that you have proof that you fulfilled your obligation. Sometimes I get asked, well, is that my responsibility or the general contractor's responsibility? Someone needs to post it, and if you're employing the labor, technically it's your responsibility. Another suggestion, contract language. So the developer must, in their bid, provide specific language around 29 CFR Part 5.5, which is all of these prevailing wage requirements. That language must flow from the agency to the prime contractor, from the prime contractor and any subcontractors, in fact, all sub-tier contractors. So even if there's 7 levels down, that language has to be there. In fact, if that language is not there, the contractor is allowed to request a change order and basically say, you didn't communicate my responsibilities effectively. And I know that can be hard for subs to work with their primes on that. And sometimes I'm like, well, if you don't want to do this job, we'll find somebody else. But just know that legally that language has to be in there. Another core question I get asked is, what if on mid-project, do I have to worry about wage rates changing? And generally speaking, in Davis-Bacon, you do not have to worry about wage rates changing throughout the life of the contract. The exception is what they call a 10-day rule, which is if the wage rates have increased 10 days prior to the bid opening, the agency must issue an addendum with a wage rates to the bidder's list. Again, failure to do this subjects the agency to a change order for the difference in wages. They can't just say, oh, we forgot, but you actually need to pay these wage rates. Assuming the wage rates have not changed more than 10 days, then those wage rates are in effect for the entire life of the bid. So even if the bid went on for 3 years, those wage rates are the wage rates that you'd have to pay. So I'm seeing another question here. What happens if a position is not on the prevailing wage list? Example, a plumber's apprentice or helper. So generally speaking, apprentices are on those wage determinations, and your apprenticeship program can usually provide that information. Typically, it's a percentage of the wage determination. And so that's kind of a predefined, this apprentice for this trade in this area gets 75% or what have you. And frequently it varies depending on how their tenure in the apprenticeship program. So year one would make less than a year four might make. If the just finishing up on that, if there's a wage rate or job occupation that is not in the bid, actually you need to get a conformance and request a conformance from that developer. We had a scenario where there was a solar contractor in California. They wanted people to open the boxes that the solar panels came in, not attach them, not move them, not do anything other than open the boxes. But box opener wasn't a listed occupation or wage on the bid, and they went and said, can we get this added? And they did in fact get it added, but they could not just arbitrarily say, box opener, I'm just going to make up a wage rate for box opener. No, you have to get that approved. Not all apprentices are in a DOL approved program. That is absolutely true. I'm not sure if you're referring back to the Inflation Reduction Act, but those apprentices would actually not qualify. So you would not meet those apprenticeship obligations if they were not enrolled in a DOL registered program. And to be extra specific here, there are different types of approved programs. Some are state approved or regionally approved versus DOL federal approved, but it needs to be a government registered program, not just kind of a self-determined program. The question was, couldn't a box opener be classified as a common laborer? If that common laborer isn't in the bid, and in this case, only electrician was in the bid, no, you could not use common laborer. So the bid will specify what would be required. If all it specifies is electricians, then all that can be on that project without a conformance would be electricians. And it would have to be the bid, not the wage determination. So the wage determination might have labor and so forth and so on, but the bid itself might only have electrician as an example. And again, if labor isn't actually in the bid, then you can't just add labor. One of the issues with the Inflation Reduction Act is because these are not government projects, you don't have all of this language in the bid. And so to some extent, it's really unclear what contractors need to do to comply. Can they just select labor in my example? Very, very much unclear at this point, and the government's still coming out with regulations around that. But when you're on a Davis-Bacon or more state prevailing wage projects, those bids will actually include the specific occupations that are allowed, if you will. Okay, so a couple of best practices. Number one, require all of your subcontractors to submit their certified payroll reports and related compliance documentation, including, and this is the key part, a right to request. If you do not have a right to request, then you're on much weaker ground as a prime or a higher tier subcontractor. If you have that right to request and someone is all of a sudden, as a subcontractor of yours, under investigation or not providing you information or not doing things that they should be doing, then you can actually withhold payment. But without that right to request, that gets very difficult. Another best practice is be sure to check contractor eligibility. Again, this is for primes and subs hiring subs, but there are debarment lists. And if you're hiring a sub, you need to be sure that you are not on that debarment list, or you're not hiring a sub that's on that debarment list. So, as you're doing bids for primes, maybe take a screenshot of showing I'm not on the debarment list. You don't have to check. I'm here. But if you're hiring a sub, do check. And most states have their own debarment lists. For instance, California has the California Labor Standards Enforcement debarment list. But if you just Google the state and debarment list, typically that website will come right up. Is this only for the Inflation Reduction Act? I apologize, I'm not clear on that question. So I'm going to go on, but if you can give me some more context there. Okay, so if you were a union contractor, you would pay your workers their mandated base wages, and you would send their mandated fringe benefits off to the union. If you're a non-union contractor, or as I mentioned, a merit shop contractor, then what frequently happens is you simply pay the fringe benefit plus the base wage into the paycheck. And that's legal, but it's also really costly. And here's why it's costly. Because every dollar that goes in the paycheck is subject to these three categories: unemployment taxes, typically 2 to 10%, depending on the state. Federal caps out, so that's a minor piece, but that's still there. Social Security taxes, that's FICA, that's 7.65% right there. And then maybe most importantly, your insurance premiums, general liability, and especially work comp. So what we see back of the napkin typically is about 25%. So a $10 fringe doesn't cost $10 if you put it in the paycheck. It costs more like $12.50. Where did I get that $2.50? That 25% for taxes and insurance premiums. Question was, can you explain the right to request? So speak with your attorney, but basically in your contract language with your subcontractor, it's not just you will provide, but I have a right to request these documents. And if you don't provide these documents, then I can withhold payment. And the other question, when the trades are only listed in the bid, so yes, and again on Inflation Reduction Act, the trades won't even be listed, and it's very hard currently to determine that, because generally speaking, in prevailing wage, the trades are listed in the bid. But if you have a trade that is not listed in the bid, then you have to go get what's called a conformance. So the conformance is the process to essentially negotiate with the developer, the government entity, to say, this isn't in your bid, but I think it should be. And so an example of that recently was pipe fitters were listed in the bid, but not plumbers. Well, in this particular state, plumbers made far less and had far lower requirements than pipe fitters. But under the contract guidelines, you couldn't hire plumbers without a conformance. You would have to pay the pipe fitter rate and pipe fitter fringe in that example. Next question, who determines the apprenticeship percentages? The program or the state or the feds? So it's really varies by a geography again, but most of them are predetermined, and those predetermined percentages can be known if you ask your program. Okay, so here's an example of wages versus benefits, kind of trying to illustrate this more succinctly. So on the left is a contractor paying fringe benefits in the paycheck. On the right is a contractor paying fringe benefits into a bona fide plan. On the right is what the unions do. So if I put the money in the paycheck, then I have my base wage of $30 in this example, a fringe obligation of say $10. That gives me a total wage of $40. 25% of my $40 is $10. So that gives me a total bid cost of $50 per hour. Now, obviously, this is a super simple example. You probably have other bid costs, but I'm just looking to really specify this payroll burden issue. On the right, you have a base wage of $30. Now that becomes your total wage of $30. You still have payroll burden on that, so that's now $7.50. And I still need to discharge my fringe obligation. So I'm not giving this employee his or her $10. I am, as the employer, still giving that employee $10. So I've got to add that into my total, but now that gives me a total bid cost of $47.50. $30 plus the $7.50 of payroll burden plus the fringe obligation of $10. That's how I arrived at that $47.50. So let's look at this on an aggregate contractor basis. So if 25% of my labor hours are prevailing wage, which is high for some, low for others, just meant to be kind of a typical example. 25% of the government's 2080 annual hours, that's their safe harbor. You can use other hours and so forth, actual hours, for instance. That'd be 520 hours. I've got 25 hourly employees in the field. My hourly savings by removing the fringe from the payroll was $2.50 per hour. And multiply those three things, 520, 25, 250, and I get a savings of $32,500. So pretty significant, even though this is a relatively typical subcontractor doing a relatively typical amount of prevailing wage. Excuse me. So I've been talking about bona fide benefits. What are bona fide benefits? So bona fide is just a fancy name for legitimate, and the government stipulates what are legitimate benefits. When can you take credit? So the first is apprenticeship. But again, apprenticeship is only for government registered apprenticeship programs. For example, the ABC or the IEC electrical or ASA may have certain apprenticeship programs in certain chapters. Just registered or GRAP, government registered apprenticeship programs. Note that if you are paying prevailing wage employees the benefit in cash, it can cause morale issues with non-prevailing wage workers. It also creates an incentive for workers to slow the work to increase time on the high wage job. Jocelyn, love it, absolutely, couldn't agree more. We'll talk about that a little bit. Paid time off. So you can reduce your fringe by your PTO, vacation, holiday, sick pay plan. The exception to the rule is Executive Order 13706. And so that's at the federal level. Was put in place by Obama and has been kept in place since then, which requires 56 hours of sick time. So if your PTO policy includes sick time, then you cannot take credit for that first 56 hours. So if you had, I'm making this up, 100 hours of PTO and you had it all combined, then the first 56 hours you could not take credit on your fringes, only on the 44 hours that's beyond that 56 hours that's required. Then health and welfare benefits, so things like health and medical benefits, life and disability insurance, dental and vision insurance, and then retirement plans, so profit sharing plans, 401ks, those types of plans. Those are the four categories that can be used for reducing your fringe benefit or using your fringe obligations toward. No, nothing else is applicable or available. You cannot use it to pay for gas cards. You cannot use it to pay for tools. You cannot use it for travel. There are lots of things that you can't use the money for. These are the only 4 that are legitimate bona fide fringe benefits. Jocelyn, you're absolutely right. Again, retirement can only be used for fully vested fringes, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Okay, so what is the definition? Talked a little bit about this, but just kind of going through it in depth. It must be specified. And when I say specified, I mean written and communicated to the covered employees. You can't just kind of have a plan and not tell anybody about it. You actually have to communicate that. What that typically looks like is an enrollment guide saying, here's how your fringes are going to be spent. We're offering this plan, and so on and so forth. It must be irrevocable. In fact, it must be to a third party or a trust. So contributions essentially must be fully funded. The funds have to leave your employer accounts. The exception is a non-funded PTO program, but even that really needs to be funded and accounted for so that liability is shown on your books. It needs to be specific to each employee. So you need to have accounting directly to the benefit of the skilled worker. You know, if Sally works 32 hours, it needs to be 32 hours for Sally. And if Jimmy works 42 hours, it needs to be 42 hours to Jimmy. It can't be some sort of average. And it has to be counted on that hourly basis on that WH 347 certified payroll program. So on a private project, if you have an annual PTO policy of 88 hours, we could only take credit for 32 hours. Well, if it's a private project, this wouldn't apply. If it were a Davis-Bacon project, that would be correct. You would only be able to take credit for those 32 hours beyond that 56 hours. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so bona fide retirement programs. This is where Jocelyn was absolutely correct. It has to be 100% vested. Contributions must be irrevocable. Note, these are employer contributions. Employee choice is not required. And so, you know, I'm frequently asked, well, what if the employees don't enroll, or what if the employees don't want it? There are lots of things about how we run our businesses that are not up to the employee. I mean, they don't get to pick typically what truck they drive or what job site they work on, or various aspects of their role. This is the same. This is an employer decision. And an easy example is you get to pick your health plan. If you want Blue Cross, because that has the best rates and best benefits and is appropriate for your company, but they don't like Blue Cross and they like Humana better, too bad. You've picked Blue Cross because that was right for your company. You do not have to get their permission at all. You do have to communicate, well, yes, communicate it, but also contribute on that hourly basis. On a retirement program, you can actually change your contribution based on the job class or the job site. So a couple of examples. If you had a school and that school had really high fringes and you wanted to contribute more of those fringes to a bona fide plan, you could do that. And then if you had a courthouse that had lower fringes and you wanted to contribute less to that obligation, you could do that. In other words, you as the employer get to pick the contribution that you're making by that job site or by that job classification. So if you have, say, master electrician versus laborer, well, for the master electricians, I might contribute 50% to the retirement program and 50% to cash wages. But for laborers, I might contribute 100% to the retirement program and none to wages. Or I could do it based on tenure. So anybody with more than 5 years of experience, they are exempt and they get cash fringes. Anybody with less than 5 years job tenure, I would contribute all of the fringes into a retirement program. You can set up standalone profit sharing plans, meaning fringes only plans, or you can set up more of a traditional 401k that is in conjunction with elective deferrals. And so I want to be clear here, these fringes are not necessarily a match. You can reduce your fringe by the match, but a lot of employees don't contribute on an elective basis into their 401k. You can still put 100% of your fringe obligation into that retirement program. Again, you do not need their concurrence, is the actual language of the DOL. If they've got a $10 fringe and they worked 40 hours this week on that $10 fringe and you've got $400, you can put all $400 into that, either that fringes only plan or into that 401k, provided you code it correctly and track it on an hourly basis and so forth. Contributions can be leveraged to help owners, or what are referred to as HCEs, highly compensated employees, for their own plan designs for their own contributions through their plan design. We'll talk a bit more about that, and I'll give you some examples. And another key point here is that retirement plans with essentially immediate vesting, that's less than 500 hours they're vested, these plans are exempt from annualization at the federal level and for most states. There are a couple of states, Illinois and New York, that actually annualize state prevailing wage fringe retirement plan contributions. But most states, the other 48, don't do that. Okay, so here's a profit sharing example. And a profit sharing, as you may be familiar, is a little bit of a misnomer. You don't have to have profits to have a profit sharing plan. It's simply a tax deferred vehicle to make contributions into a plan from the company. So in this example, I've got employees 5 through 12 that have a prevailing wage contribution. And because I've already made that employer contribution of fringe obligations, I'm not making any contribution whatsoever to their profit sharing plan. In other words, I've already given them a profit sharing contribution because this is an employer obligation. Then I have some non-prevailing wage employees. An actual example was an employer that hired a past felon. They did a lot of government work that required a security clearance. This employee could not get a security clearance. Fantastic employee, they just weren't eligible for prevailing wage for this particular company. So they gave this employee a pretty substantial profit sharing contribution to retain them and incentivize them and so forth, and make them feel like they were a prevailing wage employee, even though they didn't actually work on the military base. Then I might have a office manager or other people make a contribution to them because they didn't have any prevailing wage fringes. And then notice my highly compensated employees, my owner, owner's spouse, owner's child. Now I'm making a pretty substantial contribution by meeting testing requirements of using all of these fringe obligations. So that's one example. Another example is what we call the boost. And the boost is essentially using prevailing wage contributions, this $300,000, to meet testing. And if one didn't use that prevailing wage contribution, you wouldn't be able, as an owner or highly compensated employee, to max out these 401k contributions. In fact, you might not even be able to contribute at all. So if you've gotten if you haven't met testing and you've had to do refunds and put money that was in your 401k back through payroll for your highly compensated employees, this is a way to solve that issue. So retirement is the exception to annualization, again, if it's fully vested. Health benefits such as dental, vision, major medical, life, etc., all essentially insurance benefits must be annualized. And annualized is the government's Department of Labor's interpretation of legislative intent. And essentially their interpretation was that private job hours should not benefit from publicly funded fringe obligations. So you need to come up with essentially an amortization schedule or an annualized schedule for total hours worked and therefore what you can deduct from the fringe should there be a fringe. And if there is no fringe, what you need to come out of pocket to pay. So in this example, I've got $500 per month times 12 months might be an annual contribution of $6,000. Again, I'm just using easy math. Let's say I've got health insurance of $400 and then specialty benefits of another $100, $500 a month times 12 months, $6,000. I would then divide that contribution of $500 per month that I, as the employer, am making to arrive at $2.89. So 6,000 divided by 2,080, $2.89 in this example. So let's say I have a $10 fringe. On that project, I can take $2.89 of credit from that $10 fringe. The remainder of that, so the $7.11, if I did my math right, that would need to either go into the paycheck or into a vested retirement program. Now, if I were on a private project and there is no fringe, I would have to come out of pocket that $2.89. Again, that's all hours worked. So just think, annualization is all hours worked. It must be consistent. That employer contribution has to be there always. It's just that you're reducing the fringe obligation by that per hour amount where it's applicable. Hour banking is something that, to my knowledge, we actually invented. Essentially, it's designed to help variable hour employees stay on their health insurance and on their insured products. If you're in a northern climate and you do a lot of work in the summer and not much work in the winter, because I'm making this up, a roofer, then this can be a really effective program. So it essentially works as a savings account when they're working high hours because it's clear weather and so forth. Then you're banking those dollars, those hours. So in this example, in July, worked 160 hours. I'm setting a threshold in this case of 130 hours. And because 160 is 30 hours in excess of my threshold, I'm going to bank 30 hours. 180 in August, use 130 as my threshold. That's all consistent. But now I have 80 hours, 30 plus 50. Then I start to draw down my bank because in September, this person only worked 100 hours. Now I drew 30 hours to keep that person on benefit. In October, they only worked 80 hours. So now I've drawn down another 50 hours. So now my bank is fully depleted. They would actually fall off coverage if they didn't work 130 hours the following month. So that's the concept between hour banking. Again, creating a per hour cost. You're reporting hours, you're paying for hours. Doesn't matter whether it's private work or public work, you're always paying, in this example, $3 per hour. So, I'm frequently asked, well, how do I get my employees on board? And I like to start off with, well, let's not get the cart before the horse. Is this right for you as an employer? Because if it's right for you as an employer, then yes, we can get your employees on board. And that's really the job of a provider. So first and foremost, as we've talked about, this is going to free up money. It's either going to make your bids more competitive in that earlier example of $30,000+. If you're losing these bids by $10, $15, $20,000, well, now you've just made it a competitive bid. Or if you're already winning these bids, that just drops to the bottom line. That now is higher profits. And by the way, you can share some of those profits with those employees. And so through that profit sharing type program, don't have to, but you could. It's going to free up your cash flow. So construction cash flow is a big deal. If you're paying those wages, those fringes as wages, then you've got to pay them weekly. If you're paying it as bona fide benefits, you have 90 days to pay to make that contribution. So I wouldn't advise you to wait until the 89th day, but maybe 60 days, and now you may well have gotten reimbursed by the payer for that work and for those fringe obligations. As someone mentioned earlier, you're going to equalize wages between public and private work. So this is a really big deal. Frequently we get into a lot of consternation between, well, I've been here longer than Jimmy, and Jimmy's making like twice as much as I am on that public project. Why? I want to be on that public project. And so by removing the fringe dollars from the paycheck, yes, the employee's still getting it, but now they don't have access to it. Now they're not spending it at the bar, showing up on Monday in a brand new F-250. They're not feeling that difference, and that can lessen that consternation. Fourth, it's meaningful benefits. I mean, there's a reason every single one of the Fortune 1000 offer bona fide benefits or benefits. They do it because they actually are a good recruitment and retention tool, especially against union contractors. Unions are saying, don't go work for those guys. They don't have good benefits. We have good benefits. Come work for us. And so now that removes that argument that you can say, no, I'm offering exact same types of benefits. As we talked about, you can increase the retirement savings for your owner or other highly compensated employees. And last but not least, it's actually really simple to administer. The two most difficult parts of doing prevailing wage are the bid, these huge bid packets and bonds and so forth. That is hard. And then correctly recording and paying those base wages and fringe benefits, that's hard. If you're not using or haven't considered using a purpose-built prevailing wage payroll system, I would encourage you to look into Foundation Software. Foundation Software owns payroll for construction, or there's another company called MITRE. MITRE's doing some great things, and they've got this certified payroll tracking, paying, submitting certified payroll reports down to a science, and they make it really easy to administer. But once you've done the hard work of determining that Jimmy worked 10 hours and had a $10 fringe on those 10 hours, and therefore that you have to make a contribution of $1,000, whether you put that money in the paycheck or you put that money into a bona fide plan, that's easy. So let's say you're on board with this and you're looking to move forward. Then the question is, how do I get my employees on board? And it's called enrollment for a reason. We need to enroll these employees and really treat them as partners, and so that they understand why you as the contractor are doing this. Again, it's to make you competitive on prevailing wage jobs. And the example I use is, let's say you're only doing 5% prevailing wage and you're paying the fringes in cash. Well, which would you rather, craft employee? Would you rather 5% of these higher wages or 10 or 15 or 20% of these higher wages? if we can do more of this work and you can get a higher base wage, and you can also get your fringe benefits, which again, fringes were designed to be used for benefits, then that actually helps. I mean, these wages on prevailing wage jobs, generally speaking, are higher than private work. There's some examples where that's not the case in some deep red states like Alabama or Mississippi, where unions are not really prevalent. Yeah, the private wages might be higher, and then this might not be as applicable. But in most states, those prevailing wage rates are higher than private work. All of these funds are 100% vested. These are their funds. And note, that's different than a union contractor. A union contractor, you have to vest. And if you quit after 4 years, you might not get any of that pension. But if you quit after 4 years under a non-union plan, you get all of that money. Again, that's sort of like a 401k or something. They can move that money. They can keep that money. Sometimes we get into a chicken or the egg scenario of I don't have any savings and so I can't save. And while we wouldn't encourage loans against a retirement program, if that employer permits it, in that emergency situation, they can actually take a loan from that retirement account. And at least the way we manage that, that does not go through payroll. That's a direct relationship with that employee, and that employee pays themselves back, pays themselves that interest, and it can bridge that gap of I don't have any savings, so I can't save. Another question: on a Davis-Bacon project, are there requirements to maintain certain ratios of journeymen and apprentices? This can affect payroll and fringes paid. So typically on Davis-Bacon projects, there are not requirements to maintain certain ratios. However, on the Inflation Reduction Act, there are those ratios, which is 15% next year of apprentices to journeymen for the overall hours of those craft workers. So that developer is not going to get those maximum tax credits if they don't have those government registered apprentices on the job. So good to know there. So really appreciate everyone's time today. I think we're pretty much on track. And I am more than happy to answer any further questions now, or please feel free to get in touch with me directly. My contact information is there. Email is npeniston@fbg.com, or my direct number is 512-439-9990. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. If there's anything that I can answer, it would be a pleasure. And I think I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Okay, thank you, Nat, for your presentation. And again, as Nat said, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type those in the chat box. Otherwise, we appreciate you all joining us for today's webinar. This session will be on the ASA online website at the end of the day today, so you can check back and we will have it up there for you. It looks like, Nate, we do have another question.
Yeah, going back to the wage rates, as a subcontractor, if Glacier is not listed on the bid or comes out on the website and the GC does not provide these rates, can we come up with this rate based on surrounding counties? So I definitely wouldn't use surrounding counties. You need to use it where the job is. So if the job is in, I'm making this up, Travis County, you can't use Bear County, which is a nearby county. You would have to use Travis County as the wage rate. But it's something to really document and something to really get with the GC and or the developer to make sure that those are listed. Essentially, a conformance needs to be added if they forgot glaciers. How do you handle the following wage rates? 25.20 plus 12.25% plus $4.70. So is that a wage rate, or is that is one of those a fringe obligation? Wage rate infringes. Okay, so I'm assuming that the 12.25% and the 470 are the fringes, and that the wage rate is the 25.20. So the wage, the 12.25%. So doing some quick math here, 25.20 times 12.25% is $3. If I did my math right. So you have $3 plus 470, so it's a total of $7. So that $7 is your total fringe obligation to be contributed. And so you could put that whole $7 into a retirement program. You could deduct or take credit for a health and especially benefits program with, say, $3, and put, say, $4 into retirement. You could put any amount of that into cash wages, meaning add it to the 25.20 base rate, and pay the taxes and insurance. So those are your different opportunities. Does that answer the question? My pleasure. Well, great. Well, thanks everyone for your time. I hope this has been helpful, and please feel free to follow up with me and with ASA, and if there are any questions, anything that you would suggest we do differently or improve, open to feedback. And with that, I will let everyone get on with the rest of their day.
Okay, thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your presentation, Nat. Everyone have a great day, and we look forward to you joining us on our next ASA webinar.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.